This is my 2022 bullet journal, and at the end of every year, at the end of my bullet journal, I like to create some kind of summary spread. These usually include a summary of the themes that I made that year, some statistics on habits, and an overview of content I consumed. This year, I want to do something a little different in that last category. For some context, at the end of every month, I create a monthly overview spread where I write down all the songs I listened to, places I visited, movies I watched, books I read, as well as general statistics that I've been tracking that month. Usually what I do at the end of the year is I take all of these for every month and I rewrite them in the back of my journal for a full 2022 list. This year, I don't feel like rewriting all of those things, so I decided to do something a little different. This year, for songs, I'm just going to pick a top song from each month and then write them out in a single playlist spread. And for books, I'm going to do the same. Each month, I'm going to pick a top book. But then what I'm going to do is pit those books against each other in a bracket-style competition to determine my top 3 books of the year. So first, I'm going to start with the songs. And I'm basically just going to go through each of my months and pick my favorite song. So this was January. I had Smoking Out the Window by Bruno Mars, Love Grows by Edison Lighthouse, Amsterdam by Fleming, Leuk by Antoon, Vluchtstrook by Chris K, Overpass Graffiti by Ed Sheeran, and Brabant by Guus. In January, I was actually in Portugal with some friends, and they taught me or made me listen to a bunch of Dutch music, and that's why there's a lot of Dutch songs here. And I think for that reason, I want to pick one of these. So I think I'm going to pick Leuk by Antoon. Next, let's flip over to February. So for February, I had Cold Hearts by Elton John and Dua Lipa, Till Forever Falls Apart by Ash and Phineas, and Brabant by Guus. I think for this one, I'm going to pick Brabant just because that's a song that I've listened to throughout the year a lot. Next, we're doing March. So for March, I had Dick Down in Dallas, Cinema, A Little Bit of Everything, and Already Home. I think for this month, I'm going to pick Cinema by Samuel Berger. I think that's the one that I listen to the most, and I vividly remember activities I did while listening to that song. Next, we have April. Just a Cloud Away by Pharrell Williams, a bunch of early 2000s hits, which I didn't write the specific songs down, I just wrote that I listened to a lot of 2000s hits. I Miss You by Blink-182, We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel, As It Was by Harry Styles, Can I Have This Dance by Francis and the Lights featuring Chance the Rapper, and Wish You Were Sober by Conan Gray. In April, I was in Portugal again, and I did a few road trips to Lisbon and Porto, and that's when I listened to a lot of this middle chunk. So I definitely want to pick one of those. I think I'm going to pick We Didn't Start the Fire because during the road trip, we actually read the lyrics for that song, and I think it's very fitting for 2022 and the pandemic and all that stuff. So we're going to go with We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel. Then we have May. For May, I just had 2 songs. Wish You Were Sober by Conan Gray, and Happier Than Ever by Billie Eilish. I think for these 2, I'm going to pick the first one. For June, we have Maybe My Soulmate Died, Dandelions, Daylight, This Love, Devil Doesn't Bargain, and Don't Blame Me. I think that's a good mix of songs, and it's hard to pick just one, but I think I'm going to go with The Devil Doesn't Bargain by Alec Benjamin. Next, we have July. For July, I was traveling a lot, so I don't think there's actually a lot of songs on this list. Yeah, so there are 2 songs. The first is Jambo Bwana, and then the second one is Chicken Fried. I'm definitely going to pick Jambo Bwana. Jambo Bwana was the song that we listened to most on our trip to Tanzania, and I think it's very reminiscent of that trip in general, so I think that's definitely the song of that month. For August, there's a few more songs than last time. We have Blonde by Macy Peters, Disaster by Conan Gray, Telepath by Conan Gray, Miss Americana and the Heartbreak Prince by Taylor Swift, Paper Rings by Taylor Swift, and Cruel Summer by Taylor Swift. As you can tell, I was on a Conan Gray and Taylor Swift phase during August. I think although Cruel Summer really reminds me vividly of the end of August and also the move I was preparing for, I think Disaster is the song that I listened to the most and would consider the top song of that month. So I'm gonna go with Disaster. So in September, there were 2 songs. The first was Cut Your Bangs by Girlpool, and the second is No One Has to Know by Thomas Heden. Honestly, I don't remember how Nobody Has to Know goes anymore, whereas I do sometimes still catch myself singing Cut Your Bangs, so this seems like a pretty obvious one. Next we have October. We have I Will Follow You Into the Dark by Death Cab for Cutie, I Don't Know How I Survived by Death Cab for Cutie, Unholy by Sam Smith, and The Midnights album by Taylor Swift. In October, I went to a Death Cab for Cutie concert, so I think that I should definitely pick one of those 2. And the second one is probably the one that is more representative of this year and of that concert. So I'm gonna go with I Don't Know How I Survive by Death Cab for Cutie. Then we have November. This one is a bit trickier. I only had one item on my playlist overview, and it's the 3 a.m. version of Midnights by Taylor Swift, which is an album and not a song. So I think I'm just going to do my favorite song on that album at that time, which I think was Vigilante Shit. So I will have Vigilante Shit as my November song. And then lastly, we have December. And for December, we have Cut Your Bangs again, and then Until I Found You. Because I already did Cut Your Bangs for September, I'm gonna do Until I Found You for December. Now I'm just gonna write them all down on this spread. So the way I set up this spread was I drew a little box and a play button icon for each song that I'm going to include, so that means each month. And for each of the album covers for each of those songs, I drew that month's flower as a sort of cover art. At the beginning of the year, I set a floral theme for this journal, so I thought it would be fitting to make these the different month flowers. I did rush some of the drawings, but I still think it's a nicer spread than if I just written out all the songs. And here is my final spread. So now on to the books. I'm going to do the same where I just go through each of the months, the books that I wrote down, and pick my favorite. So for January, my top books were 1,000 Ships, Know My Name, and The Beekeeper of Aleppo. These aren't ordered, these were just the order in which I read them. Of these 3, I think my favorite was Know My Name. It was a really emotional book, but so well written and truly, truly a great read. For February, my top reads were Firekeeper's Daughter, Speaker for the Dead, and Sense and Sensibility. I liked all of those books, but I think my favorite for that month, or this group specifically, is Speaker for the Dead. I listened to it as an audiobook while on a road trip, and I think it was just a really good experience. In March, I have 2 top favorite books. The first was Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and the second is I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. Although I gave I'm Still Here 5 stars and Infinite Jest only 4, I think Infinite Jest was a more impactful book and probably one of my favorite books of all time, even if I didn't love the experience of reading it, which is kind of how I rate my books with regards to stars. So for March, my favorite book is Infinite Jest, which is also very fitting because I think I spent the majority of my time in March reading that book. Then for April, my favorite books were all part of the Poppy Ward trilogy, and of that series, my favorite is The Dragon Republic. So my favorite book for April will be The Dragon Republic. In May, I read a lot of really good books. Of this list, my favorites were American Gods by Neil Gaiman, Factfulness, Book Lovers by Emily Henry, and The Night Circus. I think of these 4, my favorite is American Gods. Again, I read that one on audiobook, and it was just a really great experience overall. And I think the other ones, although I really enjoyed them, didn't stick with me as much as American Gods did. Then we have June. In June, I felt like I read a lot of books, but I didn't read a lot that I really enjoyed. My two favorites, I think, were Letters to the Lost and The Vanishing Half. And of those two, I'd say I liked The Vanishing Half more, and it was a more impactful story. Now on to July. I think my favorite books from this list are Daughter of the Moon Goddess and The Final Empire, which is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. Of these two, I'm going to pick The Final Empire, although I didn't actually end up reading any of the rest of the Mistborn trilogy because I felt the story was satisfying enough the way that it ended and the rest of the story wasn't interesting enough. I was very much on the edge of my seat while I was reading this book. For August, I think my favorite books are going to be Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating and The Precipice by Noam Chomsky. A lot of these books, looking back at it now, are romance books, which is kind of interesting. But between Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating and The Precipice, I think The Precipice is my favorite book of that month. I think Chomsky's work in general is always really good, and it's not particularly reflective of that month, but I do think it's my favorite. For September, I reread Legendborn, which is probably one of my favorite books of all time. But because it's a reread, I'm not going to include it in the list. And then besides that, I didn't read a lot because I was sick for most of September. But of the other three, I think my favorite has to be Lessons in Chemistry. For October, I'm going to say that my favorite books were Icebreaker, Babel, and Partners in Crime. And of those three, I think my favorite is Partners in Crime. Honestly, I don't think any of these were 5-star books for me, but I think Babel dragged on for too long, and so did Icebreaker, whereas Partners in Crime was the perfect pace for me. And even though it wasn't the most interesting or exciting or engaging story, I think I enjoyed reading that one the most. So for November, I already know my favorite book, the one that I'm going to bring into the book bracket, but I do want to still share all my favorites or top books from that month. The first one is Gods of Jade and Shadow. The second one is Bloodmarked. The third is The Atlas Paradox. And lastly, Doing Good Better. Honestly, all of these books were really great, and if they hadn't all been in November, I probably would have had more of them move on to this book bracket. But by far my favorite book of that month, and probably one of my favorites of the year, was Bloodmarked. I had it as one of my most anticipated books for this year, and it really lived up to the hype, although I read it thinking that the series was going to be a duology, and it ends up being a trilogy, which I didn't figure out until 5 pages till the end of the book, which is not great, but I'm very excited for the last book in that trilogy to come out, and despite that, it was such a good book. And then lastly, we have December, and for this, I think my favorite books, or my top books, were Him, Alone with You in the Ether, and The House on Mango Street, and I think of those three, my favorite is probably Alone with You in the Ether. Okay, so those were all my favorite books. Now I'm going to write all the titles down in this visual book bracket that I created. The way that I set up this bracket was I created 12 colorful rectangles, each for a different month. I didn't want to write the titles over and over again when I compare them, so I color-coded each month so that as I pick a winner, I'll just write down or color in the next level round of this bracket in that color. I ended up not writing the full titles for a lot of the books because I didn't have a lot of space, and again, it's more about the fun of writing this all down and creating a top 3 from this bracket than having a full list of every book title, since I already have my 5-star reads on this page and all my other books in this journal. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to compare each of these books to each other, pick a winner, and then all the winners will go into a second round of 6, where again, they'll be compared to each other. After that round, there'll be a top 3, and I'll just rank those 3 based on how I'm feeling. Okay, so first we're doing January versus February, which is Know My Name versus Speaker for the Dead. This really hurts because I really enjoyed Speaker for the Dead, but I know that of those two, my favorite is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. It was just such an impactful story, and honestly, one of the books I recommend to everyone who wants to read nonfiction. Next, we have The Infinite Jest versus The Dragon Republic. Like I said, really loved the Poppy Wars trilogy, and I really enjoyed reading those. It was while I was in Portugal, which is always a nice environment to read a book in. But Infinite Jest was just such an impactful and good book that I can't not pick that. Then on to May versus June, we have American Gods versus Vanishing Half. I'm kind of annoyed that I picked this orientation of colors because of those two books, my favorite is definitely American Gods, but of those two colors, my favorite is definitely the purple. Then I kind of did it clockwise, so this is now July versus August. This is a really tough one because one is a sci-fi fantasy book, the other is a nonfiction book about the state of the world. So one is very intriguing and mysterious and meant to be a form of entertainment, whereas the other is a bit more sad and realistic and is meant to be a form of learning and information gathering. I think of these two, I remember The Precipice better than I remember The Final Empire, and I just love all of Chomsky's writing. So in terms of overall, I think it makes sense to have a Chomsky book go on to the second round. Then we have Lessons in Chemistry versus Partners in Crime. I like that both of these were more lighthearted books, but I gave Lessons in Chemistry 5 stars and Partners in Crime only a 4 because Lessons in Chemistry, I think, is the better book, or at least it's a book that I enjoyed more. So it's a pretty obvious choice. And lastly, we have Bloodmarked and Alone with You in the Ether, both of which I didn't have enough space to write the full title for. I'm hesitating as though this isn't an easy answer, but it is. It's Bloodmarked. On to round 2. In matchup 1 of round 2, we have Know My Name versus Infinite Jest. I'm gonna be honest here. When I was saying before that I could predict my top 3, or I had a feeling of what my top 3 were, I didn't think through the fact that Know My Name and Infinite Jest might have to go against each other, because I think I would have put them both in my top 3. I've spoken about Infinite Jest with people a lot more, and so it feels like a book that I've engaged with for significantly longer, but I know that I was frustrated during some parts of that reading experience, whereas Know My Name was just fantastic all the way through, even though it was a deeply individual experience. So I think I'm gonna go with Know My Name. Okay, then we have matchup number 2, American Gods versus The Precipice. I think this one's easier, and I'm just gonna go with American Gods. That's what my gut is telling me. I think it's nice because it also means I'm gonna have a sci-fi book in my top 3. And then the last matchup is Bloodmarked versus Lessons in Chemistry, and that one, pretty easy for me. It's Bloodmarked. And now I have to pick a top 3. So the options are Know My Name by Chanel Miller, American Gods by Neil Gaiman, and Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn. So I think American Gods is definitely my third one. And I had a feeling that it would be between Know My Name and Bloodmarked as my top 1 before going into this. And still, it's a hard decision. I think in terms of book I would read again, probably Bloodmarked. But in terms of book I would recommend to other people, it would be Know My Name. And in terms of books where I had a more enjoyable reading experience, it would be Bloodmarked. But in terms of book that I think had the most impact and was the most meaningful, it would be Know My Name. I think the fact that Bloodmarked is part of a series makes me want to put Know My Name as my first choice, because Bloodmarked was still not a complete book or story in and of itself, and I know that when I think about Bloodmarked, I'm thinking about the series as a whole, and that's definitely biasing me. So I have decided my number 1 is going to be Know My Name by Chanel Miller. My number 2 is Bloodmarked, and my number 3 is American Gods. And with that, here's a flip through of every month's cover page and the end of year overview pages.